This is Neil King for Random Acts of Cartooning, and I'm going to do a couple things this episode. I'm looking at this new book, Stan Lee Lied by Chaz Gower, and while I'm talking about this specific book, I'm going to do an illustration using some of the most famous characters by Jack Kirby and Stan Lee. So at the beginning of this, as always, I kind of did a rough sketch underneath. This is an 11 by 14 piece of paper. So it has all the very famous characters, the Hulk, Iron Man, Thor, Ant-Man, and the Wasp. They are, I guess, the original Avengers. This is the book that I'm kind of reviewing while I'm going through this and talking about some of the history of Marvel Comics, and especially these characters that are so well known and are still highly sought after as things that from television and film and everything. So the book in itself is really trying to just get to the bottom of who created what at the beginning for Marvel. And I feel like most people who aren't comic fans, or especially comic fans who follow some of the things that have happened historically at Marvel, they have an idea that Stan Lee was the one who wrote everything and created all the characters, and then somebody else did the illustrations. They may recognize what the characters look like, even the old versions, and that style, but they wouldn't have related it to anybody else but Stan Lee, because it's not like most people don't read comics, especially back then. It wasn't like so many people were reading them, but a lot of kids did read them, right? So what the book does is it just tries to shine light on how all of this stuff happened. So if you don't know much about Stan Lee or Jack Kirby, these are kind of things that I'm just going to talk about while I'm doing this process. As you can see, I'm just going in there and I'm outlining some of my pencils and tightening them up. This is a big sketch, 11 by 14. It's like a multimedia kind of paper. It's about a 90-pound paper, and I'm just using markers and brushes and stuff. So what I really liked about the book was that they really kind of got right to it, where they were like saying, where did Jack Kirby come from? Where did Stan Lee come from? And how did they meet to create some of these really sought-after characters at a time when comics was really kind of at its low point? And so one of the big things that I think they did well, that Gower does well, is kind of put things into timelines. He uses quotes from Stan Lee because Stan Lee really creates the timelines for everybody to look at. He's creating the history. But someone like Gower, and he's not the first one to look into this, but I think that he's done a pretty nice job of combining a lot of the facts that are out there about the history of the comics for the people who are still alive, and interviews from Kirby and all the different artists that were out there at the time. So if you understand what's going on here, what Gower is really trying to show is that before Jack Kirby, Stan Lee had not done anything like the type of work that was about to come out in the 60s. So Stan Lee, his uncle, Martin Goodman, was the publisher of Marvel Comics. It was Timely Comics and it was Marvel. And for years, he just kind of worked helping out, making sure things are getting published. They did a lot more publications. They did things, adult magazines. They did all kinds of different things. It wasn't just comics, but they did have a comic line. And so you have to understand that back then, comics were really big for a while, but then they kind of lost a lot of favor in the 50s. So DC Comics was also in trouble at that time, but they still were around. They just had a lot of unique things that were going on, and societally, parents were starting to think that comics were bad. The AC Comics explosion with all the horror comics, a lot of parents kind of were pushing back, and even Congress. There was a lot of things that were getting done. So it really kind of hurt comics, and so everyone was struggling at the time, but especially this Timely or Marvel Comics. So before Stan Lee got there, he was just basically working on some of the other little comics they were doing. There's some comedy ones, like with little children books. They also had like just funny kinds of characters, and that were around. And he worked on those things, but he didn't come up with any kind of books himself that he was creating that people really kind of followed. He did some work. He did some script stuff. He worked in what I'll talk about as the Marvel method with some of the artists at the time, and but Stan Lee never had, as Gower said, a hit comic in the 40s and 50s. So that's the first thing you have to understand. He's like 10 years younger than Jack Kirby, who was already in that period working on comics and had already done a lot of work himself with another co-creator. So Jack Kirby started in the late 30s, like 1938. And he was doing all kinds of comics. He was working on lots of titles. He worked, with Joe Simon, and by 1941, he created Captain America for Timely, for what would become Marvel. Now, at that time, Stan Lee was just like a gopher. And Captain America sells millions of copies. Super popular. Remember, 1941, that's World War II is happening. Very, very, very popular. And eventually, it sold millions of copies, and then he would leave for DC Comics. He would create all kinds of different characters and stories, multiple things, did very well, right? So all of this stuff is happening. And in the 50s, again, there are problems that are going to be happening for the industry. So everyone's having a hard time with superhero books, and they start to kind of lose all that momentum. But remember, they're still selling. Like DC is still doing Batman, they're still doing Superman, and some of those other titles, still selling millions of copies. But Timely and Marvel are really struggling. They don't have anything right then. So Kirby is doing freelancing, creates the Challengers of the Unknown at DC Comics. This is 1956. He also creates Sky Masters of Space Force. He's doing all kinds of freelance work, really popular. These books are selling really well. Like back then, you could sell 300 to 500,000 copies a month, compared to what the very paltry amount of comics that are being sold now. Like people don't understand how popular they were back then. So during this whole time, Marvel is starting to die out. And so Jack Kirby is coming back to Marvel, and he starts doing these monster stories. So that's keeping Marvel up and running, as Gower is saying. The idea is, trying to create monthly character, these big monster characters. Kids loved it, very sci-fi. And that's going to be the theme of what Gower is trying to say here, is that Kirby has been creating sci-fi kinds of characters, all types of monster books, all kinds of group books that were created before he came over to Marvel, right? And went full-time and created these characters. So about that time, so these books are doing really well. And then Kirby decides, he tells Goodman and he tells Stan Lee that he has a bunch of new ideas. He calls it this blitz. And he comes up with Thor, with the Hulk, with Ant-Man, with Spider-Man, with the Avengers, Iron Man also. All of these characters, these were all Kirby characters. He was doing 100 pages of art a month. And the thing that I really like about this idea is that what Gower is showing is that there are certain amounts of things at the beginning that Kirby was just doing himself. He was doing a lot of those monster stories all himself. Stan Lee was not signing anything at the time because there will be a point in the Marvel stuff that Stan Lee will just say that he's the writer. Now, one of the things, if you don't know about it, is that there's the Marvel method, and I've talked about it before in some of my videos. But the idea that you have someone, the artist, who plots out the story and comes up with all the action, the characters, the ideas of why they're doing whatever they're doing, and that someone will come in and they'll dialogue it afterwards. So they'll look at all the stuff. That's what Stan Lee would do. He would look at all the pages, and they would all have notes about the action, and he would put in dialogue depending on what each panel would say. Now, back then, when you're, related to the publisher's, his uncle, you would be able to say these things. You would say, "I'm writing this stuff," and everyone else is just doing the art. And at the time, remember, it's not like this is a thing that many people worked in. Jack Kirby was creating all of the Marvel output. Eventually, Steve Ditko would come over and start on the other things, and Steve Ditko is a whole different problem. He's like another one of the great creators of comics, and especially with Spider-Man. But Spider-Man was initially, as far as Gower is showing, that this was a Jack Kirby idea. They changed it for a lot of the things to make it better, but originally it was a Kirby idea. The Fly, it had already done something like this, and if it wasn't for Steve Ditko, it probably would have come out the way that Kirby initially had decided it was going to be. But Ditko was brought onto it, and he changed it. And for the better, he did a lot of great stuff. But the problem with it, as always, is that Stan Lee took a lot of the credit for the decisions that were made, because his name was the writer on it, even though he wasn't writing any of that copy. He was just doing the dialogue of all the ideas that the artists were coming out with. Now, it's a small industry, even though they're selling 500,000 copies to 1 million copies per month. It's a crazy thought how popular these things were. But these were for children, and this is very inexpensive stuff to buy, and parents bought them and kids bought them. They were probably 15 cents each at the time, and people really, loved them. So what Gower is really kind of showing in the book is, each little aspect of how some of these big events happened. And as somebody who knows a certain amount about all this time, it was very interesting to see that type of timeline to give me an idea of what else was going on. Stan Lee also was a great, he publicized everything, very important person in the whole Marvel timeline, because he really got people to look at it, and that was great. If he had only just decided to take publisher credit, I don't think anyone would be upset at him. But he's kind of like how Bob Kane was with Batman. Bob Kane didn't do much of anything on Batman, but he was the guy who had the name Batman, and that he wanted to be a crime fighter. And then I think it's Bob Fingers was the guy who actually created all the characters, all the Penguin and all, the Joker and all these characters, but never got the credit because Bob Kane signed his name to every single one of those things. So it happened again here. So it's not unique. And Jack Kirby even probably knew it back then too. He needed to pay, he had a family and he wanted to be as popular as anybody else, but this is what happens to them. So to me, it's a great read just so you can understand. There are other books that talk about this, But I think Gower does a really good job of talking about those other books and how he got information from some of those, and he put it all together with this. It really was, for me, as somebody who's thought about this for a long time, it really made me happy to kind of see someone put this all together in a nice, simple timeline, like I was saying. It's very important stuff.
Hey everyone, as always, I always remind everyone that I am a working cartoonist. So the whole point of doing my episodes is to get everybody to go to my Amazon store and buy a bunch of the books that I make. So I have all kinds of different types of books, whether it's for all ages, like Who Stole All the Heads at the Met, and all kinds of books like this, Snowmen in the Springtime, fun contemplation of what would happen if snowmen survived into the spring. And then these are some older ones that I really think a lot of kids would like. Monsters in the Box. There's 4 different books that are collected in here. You get all this on Amazon. I have all the links in the episode. And as always, I'm here doing my sketches. I do conventions and everything, and I do all kinds of commissions. So these are the kinds of pieces that I do. So always contact me about that, or look for me at some of the local conventions that you're involved in. But make sure you're liking and subscribing.
The other thing that I think is important when about the book that I think is really interesting is the way that they try and put things into perspective about the sales of all the books and how they did. I always thought that Marvel was selling close to what DC was selling, and it's really not true. He has all in the book. He has all of the sales from DC and Marvel, and like DC was almost always doubling the amount of comics that Marvel was. But Marvel really did make an impact. It's not like they didn't. They really did an amazing job. But back then, very small company that was creating something that really made an impact. And it was all because of Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko, obviously. And what happens after that is that they'll continue to use these characters. So he was showing examples of, imagine, like in 65, when some of these Fantastic Four came out, which is all a Jack Kirby creation. Marvel was selling that year for all the comics line about 1,700,000, for all their comics, where DC was 4 million, over 4 million at the same time. So it's really, you don't realize how popular Batman and Superman and all those Wonder Woman, all those kind of characters were and would be for, all through the time that Kirby was there and Ditko was there. So no matter what is said, that's what it's, by saying some of those things, I thought that was interesting, is that I always thought, because of Stan Lee making it seem like that Marvel was doing as well, that they really weren't. But that's what happens when you have a really great salesman. You really start to believe. You're like, yeah, I believe that they're this, important out there. But they really did have some great stuff, and these few representatives were doing it. So I really like that as a part of the book. The negative things about the book, I think, are that I think they could have, organized it a little bit better. There seems to be some repetition about some of the things, the facts and everything. And I do like I could have read it all again and again, but I feel like there is some repetition. And so I feel like even if they would do a second volume or try to tighten the book up, I feel like they could do that. But I was very happy with most of the way things were. And for me, as I look at this as a creator, it just makes me more interested in finding out more about that time period and more facts that people could look at to to back things up about the ideas. And I think Gower did a really great job of that. And as I was bringing up the parts where he's just showing things, like his major evidence was that Stan Lee would always sign something. And I was just bringing this up where he signed everything that he even just touched a little. You know, even if he hadn't changed text that much, he did a couple edits. I think that what Gower was showing was that when he didn't put his name on it, it really meant that he had nothing to do with it. So all the monster books that were so popular, all the things that were going on when Kirby came into Marvel, that was all Kirby. Kirby had already been doing all these stories, and if you take a look at them, there's so many characters that are going to come to the Marvel universe after they start getting really popular again with the superhero books, that they had already been done by Kirby, and that they would have gone back in and said, oh, this worked or that worked, and let's use these guys as characters. I saw one where it was like the Sandman that the Fantastic Four would eventually go against, and Spider-Man, that's a very popular character. That had already been created by Kirby in the monster books because he was so used to doing it. Now, so that's what you really are coming away from with this whole thing. His argument being, again, that Stan Lee never created sci-fi books. He never created monster books on his own. He would script them. After an artist would create some book, he would put text in and dialogue. But none of those were his ideas. He has no history of making that type of book, where all Jack Kirby was doing superheroes and monster books and sci-fi books. He also was somebody who had already done things like the Thor, the Thor character. So the problem with Stan Lee, he had never done any mythological stuff. He had never used any characters like that. But Kirby had. He had done so many books, so many types of teams, so many situations, that if you are somebody who actually would have read all the things that he had done, you would have been like, oh, these are all Kirby creations. And there's this new guy who's putting his name on things, and his name would have been Stan Lee. But Stan Lee basically was the publisher, and he had all the power, and Jack Kirby needed to be able to do his work. And this is all he did. And he eventually would leave Marvel and go to DC and create more. And the same thing happened to Ditko, who created Doctor Strange, and he created what we think of as Spider-Man. And he left and created more things for DC and other companies, where after those two major guys left, Stan Lee never created a new thing. He only used the old characters. He would come off with some bad ideas. He would also try to do the Marvel method with other great artists who I love, John Romita and Buscema, and like so many great artists, but they never really created anything that would come close to all of these characters. Even now, there aren't that many new characters that Marvel had ever come up with that really had a staying power that these characters did. So remember, it's all about copyright, it's all about power, and eventually Stan Lee would make deals because his name was on the top of all these characters. And so Marvel made deals with him. He'd make $1 million a year once he stopped doing comics. And he had all kinds of parts into all of the big money that would be coming into Marvel with the movies and all the merchandising and all that stuff, where Jack Kirby, who died years and years before him, wouldn't have gotten anything. Didn't have his artwork, didn't have a lot of the things. So if you are someone who really is interested in that whole background of how it really went down, and then you just see Stan Lee in the movies, like he has passed away now, but everyone would have been like, oh, there's that guy, he's the one who created everything. He was not the one who created everything. And books like these, I hope, will change things for generations to come, that they'll say, oh, Jack Kirby created this universe, and Stan Lee was there to promote all of this, And as a publisher, he put dialogue on top of all the stories and on top of all these ideas. Once Kirby made Fantastic Four, and he created Silver Surfer and Galactus and all of these characters. It's crazy to think there was this man who was able to create all these things that I, so many years, am still just drawing, because I love to draw these characters, and I do all my comics on my own comics, and they're all, who isn't influenced by Jack Kirby? Like, there's no one who does comics who hasn't seen all of the things that he's created, and that you bring your own piece of style or thoughts behind these characters. And that's the beauty of what Kirby is, and hopefully for generations they'll still talk about him, his greatness. So if you can, pick up Stan Lee Lied, and I think it's totally worth taking a look at. And I'd love to see what people think about it, or if you have read it, that you'll just put a comment in on this video. I'd love to hear what other people thought about it and their point of view of comics and how things are shown and how things are done. But I always think of, generationally, it's important to get the facts about who created something that really changed entertainment. And right now, we're in this time where superheroes are the biggest things in the world, and a lot of people love it. So this is a great thing for Jack Kirby and for Steve Ditko and for all fans of comics. And I appreciate you looking at this episode, and make sure that you're going to my website and onto my Amazon site and buying some of the things that I create. Here's the finish of the sketch. A lot of fun. See you next time.